Just a reminder that today is the third Sunday of the month, so there'll be an extended homily, question-answer discussion, so get your thinking caps on. And I want to start by making an apology to Matthew, Mark, and Luke for butchering and plagiarizing their accounts of the Transfiguration. Because this reading is dedicated to all new members of COJ. Jesus went up a high mountain called Mount Shasta and took with him 16 of his disciples, Heather and Jason, Joseph, Mark and Uma, Ursula, Larry and Annika, Linda, Gail, Lita, Laurie, Marion, Seán, Shalomar, and Mariana. And there appeared to him two avatars, the Buddha and Socrates. They spoke together about the kingdom of God on earth. Socrates asked some probing questions. Jesus responded with penetrating parables, and the Buddha impregnated the conversation with a profound silence. The disciples were seamlessly woven into the discussion, each contributing a unique perspective until a brand new community began to be born. Perhaps its name is Shasta on Safari, and its mission is to quietly spread the good news. Words inspired by God. The present moment is a child whose mother is the past and whose father is the future. And therefore, in order to be able to plumb the possibilities of the now, we have to be able to learn from the past, and we have to have visions for our future. This was born into me really strongly when I landed in Africa in 1972. I took with me a past where two wisdom traditions were woven together. A great-grandmother who was a Catholic mystic, and a grandfather who was a Celtic druid. And I went with the vision of what I wanted to be like as a priest, a missionary priest in Africa. And it was the meeting of those two, the past and the vision of the future, that allowed me to exercise my ministry in the present moment in Africa. And I had a little bit of the same experience last week at Mount Shasta. A group of us got together, 16 people got together, some from this community and others from coming together for the first time ever. And it felt to me like it was a present moment in which I was understanding in a different way the history of COJ and understanding in a different way the future of COJ. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one is creating community. The second one I'm going to call Shasta on Safari. The third one I'll call global evolution. And the fourth one, the difference between change and transformation. So there are the 4 points I make this morning. So the first one, creating community. Way back in the day, communities tend to form merely because of geographical proximity. Tribes, a tribe of people who live closely to each other created some kind of initial community because of just geographical proximity. And that allowed them to develop eventually a common language, and then a common culture, and then finally to fabricate foundation myths that explain to them how they got started in the first place. And in this instance, as they began to encounter other groups of people and even to go to war with them, their sense of identity was formed by the dance of two paradoxical factors: assimilation and persecution. The ability to become part of a bigger group and at the same time to be persecuted for their present cosmologies. So that has been the trajectory for many communities originally, that's how we got started. However, latterly, communities, tend to be formed differently. There was an interim stage, we call it colonialism. Colonialism got started in much the same way. But now communities tend to be formed by common interests more than, geographical proximity. And so they're called very often intentional communities. People who come together from various parts, who are crossing over ethnic lines and denominational lines, in order to be together with people, with whom they have share common interests. Now, in order for any such community to be able to thrive and go forward, there needs to be some kind of a scaffolding or some kind of a skeleton, some kind of a framework, or some kinds of orienting principles that allow the body to coalesce around this center. And for the 14 years I was in East Africa, I had 3 such orienting principles. I call them kujitegemea, which means self-reliance, kujitumukia, which means self-ministering, and kujieneza, which means self-propagating. And when we founded COJ 22 years ago, we adopted the same 3 kinds of principles. We wanted to be a community which was able to kujitegemea, to be self-reliant, to be a community that was kujitumikia, that could self-minister, and a community that could jieneza, which was to self-propagate in some way. And I think we accomplished the first 2 really, really well. Yeah, the self-reliance piece, we have never at any stage, needed to kind of borrow money from anybody outside in order to keep COJ alive. Even though regularly at the end of the year we find ourselves in the red. But the board sent out a letter, and by January 1st, miraculously, we're back in the black. And we've managed to do that for 22 years in trust. Kujitumokia, self-ministering. There is no need in this community which is not being served by members of this community. Every Sunday there's somebody standing up there being the priest for us, and it can be any member of the community. You look at any need within the group, and there's somebody within the community who's answering that need. We had a rule that whoever comes up with the idea is responsible for making it happen. So it's not a hierarchy of any kind. It's it's a group of people who are looking after the needs and reaching out to those in need outside. The third piece is more difficult to assess. This notion of kujieneza, to self-propagate in some senses. And the first thing we have to realize is that this does not mean any kind of self-promotion or beating of our chests, look how good we are. It does not involve that at all. It's not about advertising or about self-promotion. It's about trying to create a small community which is so loving that it becomes an example, for other people who want to create their own communities. So it's not that we're trying to kind of export our model to anybody else, but people inquire. So it's been fascinating to me to look at over the years how this little community has grown. It's not that there are more people in the pews on a Sunday or that our bank balance is big. It's not about that. It's the fact that some of what we have to offer has been sought by people all over the world. For instance, our Eucharistic prayer of the cosmos. There are groups now at the moment in Ireland, in England, in Germany, in Australia, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Hong Kong, who are using this Eucharistic prayer of the cosmos in their liturgies or in meditation. Because of the work that our IT people have done, like the great David Carkeek, Lorraine Moore and her brother Kenny, Michael Choi, Bill Miller, that these people have set up a system where what we do here as a little community is broadcast to the world. I just did recent analytics, and our material, like homilies for instance, have had over 1.7 million minutes of viewing time all over the world. 153 different viewers watching this material. And 3 years ago when Karen set up our Patheos blog, in just 3 years' time, there have been over 75,000 page views of that. And so even though we're a small little community, we have learned to kujieneza in a very interesting way. Not by adding numbers to our people sitting in the pews on Sunday, but by creating the kind of the kernel, which is reaching out to a much, much bigger audience. So we're creating community in an extraordinary way. And there's dialogues going on. There are people who are visiting us, who are being taken in by our community in the sense of being welcomed through phone calls, emails, text messages, snail mail, in many different ways. So it's hard for us sometimes to realize as we sit here, a small little group, that in some senses we are extending, we're being a little hive sending out bees in some senses to create honey for our world. So that's the first point of it. That's how we create community. The second one then is, I'm going to call it Shasta on safari. Between the 9th and the 13th of May this year, a group of 16 of us got together in Mount Shasta, which is in Northern California. It's a sacred mountain. It is 14,179 feet high, and has been sacred to the native peoples of that area for countless generations. And it's a place that a lot of spiritual seekers are drawn to. And this retreat was the brainchild of Heather Watkins. A lot of you know Heather. Heather has come here on a few occasions with her 4 children. One of her kids, Callista, sang very beautifully for us one time, the Hallelujah verse. She got 2 small little boys as well. And she was the brainchild behind this, and she set it up. And there were 8 members of, COJ. I call it sometimes COJ in diaspora. Not just people who are physically present here on Sundays, but are consider themselves members of COJ because they visit when they're able to visit, and they check in frequently, whether it's literally from Hong Kong or South Africa. And so there were 8 people who might call COJ people there, and 8 other people whom many of us were meeting for the first time. And Heather put together an extraordinary program, which involved, a few lectures, 3 lectures in the course of it, and then an extraordinary experience in what I can only describe as a pyramid-shaped isolation chamber. It was pyramid-shaped. You had to go into it underground and come up through it. And you find yourself in this darkened atmosphere, and 16 of us lying down there, and you could hear nothing, see nothing, taste nothing. So it's literally like being in an isolation chamber for an hour. And then we spent an afternoon and an evening at a sacred waterfall, which was sacred to the peoples of that area. And 2 nights we had what she described as ascension ceremonies, where through guided visualization and music and drumming of various kind, that we were invited to explore interdimensionally. And we had 2 cooks who dedicated their time to providing raw, vegan and vegetarian food for all of us for every meal. So it was an extraordinary experience. And towards the end of it, I began to suddenly see, my God, what's happening here? In some senses, we're birthing the twin of COJ. In Ireland we say, if 2 kids are born within 11 months in the same family, we call them Irish twins. It felt to me like this was spiritual twinning, that 2 communities were being born, twin communities were being born 22 years apart. It really felt to me like this was our sister community. There's a shared membership in some way, and that like neurons in the brain, that we are creating dendrites and axons and connections which are reaching out to the wider community all over the world. So I had a real sense that in some senses this too represented the future of COJ, the networking and the connecting with other small groups who are trying to do in the world what we are trying to do in the world, create some form of Christ consciousness by being loving, with each other and with the world. That's my second point. The third point I'll call global evolution. So when life started on planet Earth, which was about 3.7 billion years ago, the only way it could propagate itself was through cloning. There literally just existed single-celled protozoa. And for over 1 billion years, they just replicated. Each cell replicated itself, so there was no variety whatsoever. It went on by just simple cloning. And human societies eventually began to use the same kind of technique. If you look at a kind of an isolated tribe anywhere in the world, 40,000 years ago, basically what they did was they just cloned, that every member of the tribe was expected to be a cloned version of the prototype. Here's what you need to be in order to be a member of this particular community. So we literally just tried to clone members to make sure that we were identical versions of some original prototypical tribal elder. And as we encountered other tribes, this got even more solidified. As I say, we developed common language, a common culture, common foundation myth for the little group. But even when we encountered other tribes, even that contact with the others, and often it was a violent contact or warfare, it solidified our identity. And as I say, it became this notion again of, identity through the dance between assimilation into a bigger picture and persecution by the bigger picture. And when colonialism came along, it used the very same model. All the colonialists, all the empires of the world used the very same model. They wanted to create clones of themselves. When they conquered any tribe, they brought in their own religion, they brought in their own financial system, their own educational model, their own medical model, their own agricultural model. They simply tried to create clones of themselves, albeit that there was inferior, there was a lower level and a higher level. The victors were in the higher level and the victims were the lower level. But they tried to make clones actually of those whom they conquered. And the ultimate, the pièce de résistance, was when we tried to clone God. We literally created gods in our own image and likeness. And then we pretended that they had created us. And so we even attempted to clone God. So that was how life got started. And it was very difficult to see much change because it basically, reproduction consisted merely of cloning ourselves in a new version. And then something radically in biological history, something really changed where at some stage of the game, different cells learned to cross-fertilize and therefore create all kinds of permutations and combinations of themselves. And if you fast forward, the interesting thing is, sex was invented by a fish called the anti-arc pleuroderm, which went extinct about 380 million years ago. It's now extinct, but they were the first creatures who actually used sexual contact in order to cross-fertilize and lead to a huge pluriformity, an explosion of life forms. So only when you learn to cross-fertilize is there the possibility of a pluriformity of manifestation. And we see that very simply built up even in the scientific model. If you take, for instance, your computer, as you're looking at a computer screen, it's based just basically on Boolean algebra, zeros and ones. Every pixel on your screen is either on or off. It's either a 0 or a 1. But through this extraordinary sequence, combinations of possibilities, every color you see, every symbol, every character, every sound is being created by just putting these together in particular kinds of sequences. So once you stop merely cloning and have some kind of cross-fertilization, you get extraordinary possibilities for new life forms and new manifestation. Later on in biology, it got a little bit more complex, so in order to speed up the process, so instead of just being two elements, on and off, or 0 and 1, combining with each other, we had the nucleotides, A, C, G, and T, the code of DNA, and now they're just 4 elements. And these 4 elements are responsible for all life forms on the planet right now. Just particular sequences, combinations, and permutations of these. We even did it with our language. If you take, for instance, English literature, everything you'll ever read or have read, whether it was nursery rhymes or Shakespeare's Hamlet, is merely the combination and permutation of 26 symbols that we call the alphabet, which was invented 3,200 years ago by the Phoenicians. These were the first ones ever to give us an alphabet. And we've modeled this in our own evolution. This is how we progress as human beings right now. Religious historians talk about a period in human history that they call the Axial Age, between about 800 BCE to about 200 BCE, when there was this extraordinary burgeoning of new possibility all over the planet. So in China, you had, for instance, Lao Tzu and Confucius. In India, you had the Buddha and Mahavira. In Persia, you had Zoroaster. In Israel, you had the great prophets. In Greece, you had Socrates and Plato. So there was extraordinary burgeoning, and everything began to change. And for the people at the time, this was really, really upsetting. It looked like a disaster, because all these great avatars were regarded as atheists, because their idea of the divine was so radically different from what preceded it that for all intents and purposes, everybody regarded them as being blasphemers, heretics, and absolute atheists. But they showed us the next wave of what spirituality and human life would look like. I think personally that there was a second axial age that began with Jesus and maybe up to the time of Muhammad, different models of spirituality and what it meant for the greater group. But I think also that we're on the edge at this stage of a third axial age, and it's being called interspirituality. the notion that people are much more drawn to the mystical elements, wherever they find them, rather than the kind of denominational affiliation into which they were born because of geographical proximity. And what I see the future for me, it seems to be that the hardened, exoteric shell of violently proselytizing religion is giving way to the soft-backed, esoteric, smiling encounters between the mystics of various stages. And it's a model based on networking, just like the brain. It's not so much the number of neurons in the brain, and there are about 10 billion of them. It's the fact that each one of them is capable of making a myriad of connections with others, literally trillions of possibilities. And it feels to me that that is the future. That's where it's headed. It's by networking, small communities networking, small communities of people who are dedicated to the mystical core of spirituality rather than to the exoteric ritual, of religions. That for me is the axial age that we're beginning to give birth to at this stage. I think it's one of the stages that Teilhard de Chardin spoke about. Teilhard spoke about something he called the noosphere, which was like a sheath of unity consciousness surrounding the planet. Now, there had been many, many previous forms. The first, little globe was the physiosphere, the rocky third rock from the sun, just rocky material. The next sheath to surround that was the atmosphere, something that could eventually nurture life once life was birthed. And then came the third phase, the biosphere, the flora and fauna that flourished because of the atmosphere on the physiosphere. And at some stage, it moved into what I'm going to call the psychosphere, rational thinking, a sheath of rationally thinking beings who surrounded or grew out of the biosphere. And then Teilhard de Chardin talked about the next sheath, he called it the noosphere, which literally, I think, really means a sheath of unity consciousness, not just rational beings, not just even self-reflective entities, but beings who are thinking as a unity. But that's not the final stage. There are other stages after that. The next stage I call the atmosphere, not atmosphere, but atmosphere, from atma, meaning soul, individual soul in Sanskrit. That's where the human race is headed, to the realization that we're souls on safari on planet Earth, that becomes our identity, and that's where it's moving beyond mere noosphere. And there's a place beyond that. I'm going to call it the pneuma sphere. It's this place in which we realize that there's something even greater than individual soul. There is spirit, pneuma, and that there's a sheath, a pneumosphere surrounding all of this. And the final stage, I'm going to call Brahma Sphere. It's the realization that there is only God, there is only Source, and that's the ultimate shield. So we're halfway through our journey at this stage. We're moving from noosphere, hopefully, into atmosphere, eventually. And we see this again, evidence of this happening all over the world. The World Wide Web, in some senses, was exactly what Teilhard de Chardin predicted. A sheath of consciousness connecting everybody together. But we need to move beyond this into the next stage, which brings me to my fourth point. I'm going to call it the difference between change and transformation. When I look back at human history, it seems to me that change almost inevitably comes from the top and is imposed downwards, whereas transformation starts at the bottom and works its way, filters its way up to the top. Change inevitably is swift, it's violent, and it's temporary. But very, very often it leads to a reactive revolution, because anything that happens too quickly and is imposed from the top down at some stage is going to meet resistance. The question is, what is the nature of that resistance? Because if the resistance itself is attempting simply to make another kind of change, it too will become violent. And what you do is you simply substitute one dysfunctional system with another dysfunctional system. Or you substitute one tyrant with a different tyrant. And I saw this, in Africa, in my time in Africa. Many of the countries in Africa were just getting independence in the 1960s and early 1970s. And very often, the guerrilla fighters who were attempting to get independence from colonialist regimes, they did so through the force of arms and through violence. And they learned that violence works. And so when they got themselves into positions of power, they became completely corrupted. And so when change comes too quickly, and it's from the top down, it's not going to last. It will meet a reaction, which is the plea I keep making to our community and our times. We are facing a global crisis. This global crisis cannot be, it's every time the planet is faced with a global crisis, it creates an extraordinary response by elevating its own consciousness. You can't engage the crisis with the same mentality that created it. We have to elevate above that. So what we're looking for is not change. What we're looking for is transformation. Because transformation comes from the bottom up, it comes slowly, it comes organically, and it's permanent. It stays. It leads to the evolutionary process. But we have to have patience, because it can't be, my way in my time. It has to be God's way in her time. So we have to add or put our shoulders to the wheel, but do so out of a sense of love, not out of a sense of anger. So we must be agents not of change, but agents of transformation. And that's what I saw this last weekend with this little group in Mount Shasta, and what I've experienced as a member of COJ for 22 years. And as we move off into the future, that we continue to be agents not of change, but agents of transformation, where we continue to network with other like-minded groups and lovingly attempt to move us into Christ consciousness as a planet. Johanna.
I have two things. The first one is, how do you see us going forward with our twin?
Yes, okay.
And do you want to answer that? And then I'll
Sure, okay, great question. So how do I see us going forward with our twin? So for one thing, we have membership in common. And so that's already a connection between us. I see perhaps that this little group that met in Mount Shasta may meet there or elsewhere again, and that there may be an exchange of ideas coming between the two groups. And maybe the most important thing of all is, I know that sometimes it's easy for us to lose heart as a community, because we look around on Sundays and it doesn't appear to be growing in any way. Sometimes it seems to be receding numerically, and we're always struggling to kind of make ends meet by the end of the year. We always do it, however. And so it's the realization that COJ is much, much, much bigger, than the pews and the finances are telling you. And until you kind of plug into that system and realize it, you have no idea what kind of a difference you are making in this world. You're like a heartbeat, throbbing and giving life in places that you've never seen. So to hold that realization in your mind, to not be kind of fooled or disheartened by numbers, to be able to look out into the wider picture, investigate it for yourself. Just see what effects we're having in so many different areas. There are literally at this stage 40 or 45 different countries all over the globe who are in dialogue with us on a regular basis. Personally, I'm handling emails and phone calls from many, many such places who are interested in what we're doing and are attempting to try to replicate in their little communities what we're doing. So that realization, firstly. Maybe meeting with these people, maybe inviting them to come, the others to come and, and celebrate with us at some stage. So, for instance, one of the men that I had a real connection with, a guy called Shalimar, he lived on Mount Shasta, on the mountain, for 20 years in a hut in the snow on his own, with no electricity and no running water. And some of the stories he was telling were just extraordinary. He's also a beautiful musician. He sang some stuff for us. One of them I remember particularly is called When I Remember. And he sang this song looking out through the eyes of St. Peter and St. John the Apostle, going over their lives and saying, when I remember when, and then taking a biblical event and seeing it from his eyes. Beautiful music. I've asked him to try and put it up on YouTube. I just got an email from him yesterday saying, is there any possibility that he would be allowed to come down here someday and sing for us? And I wanted to jump out of my skin, totally. Yeah, totally. So that's why I say that here's the possibility to continue, that we continue to make contact with these people and through them reach other communities who are trying to do the same thing as we're doing. Because it has to be transformation, guys, it can't be change. What was the second question?
Thank you. The second question is, I went on a retreat with some shamans from the Axial tribe, and part of it was that you were taken to a hole underground and then covered with some things, and I truly was terrified.
Yes.
And I actually ended up having some lovely experiences.
Yes. Yes.
What was what was an hour like underground in a
that's
pyramid?
brilliant. Yeah, I can only speak for myself. And maybe invite Annika to share if she wants to. So we went in underground and then climbed up to a ladder into a platform inside a pyramid. There's a tiny aperture at the top, leaving in some air and a tiny bit of light. But initially, everybody's lying on the floor, you know, and I'll be honest, for about 2 minutes, my body went into shock. There's absolutely no fear. I think, holy God Almighty, I'm either dying or I'm losing my mind, you know. And what I want to do was to jump up, make noise, prove to me that I'm still alive, you know, reach out and see who's next to me or whatever, and having to fight that and then see what happened. And I had some really powerful visions as a result. But it feels to me like it was like a dying process. I had to die through fear to my own experiences. And you know, as you have somebody who's done a lot of work with shamanism, that in many shamanistic societies, they actually create dying rituals. Johnny Hannibal, you know this very well from places you've lived. They actually create dying rituals for initiates, particularly pubertal boys and girls. So they're really frightened. They think they're actually going to die physically because they have to leave their old identity and adopt a brand new one. That was my initial experience. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 2 minutes perhaps. I'm fighting the urge to jump up and make noise and reach out and touch somebody else. But, you know, moving through it and then having some really profound experience. Annika, can you say what happened for you?
It was almost a completely blackened room with an oculus at the top, as Seán was saying. And it took me a couple of minutes to settle into the space and get comfortable with the setting, because it's not your usual setting. Usually in spaces, even in our bedrooms, there's some light pouring through. And even if there was a small light pouring through at the top, it felt like entering into a womb. That was the experience for me, into the mother's womb. And I noticed my breath and my sensations, and after a few minutes, speaking from my own personal experience, it became formless, beyond this body, and noticing that there were other people in the room who were breathing. And from my experience, I felt that became one breath in one womb. And I also had visions. I received clarity about some steps I'm being called to take moving forward on my soul's journey for this mission of Christ consciousness. And it showed me the importance of going into the dark and to be comfortable enough to look at that, as that's what occurred to me over the weekend, to not only look at one aspect of ourselves and focus on that and shine from that place, but remember our wholeness. And so that was my experience.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Before I get on to Margaret, Ursi, would you tell us what the experience of the retreat in general was like for you?
For the retreat in general, it was so amazing. I mean, it was hard for me to get there, but I knew Heather put so much love into every detail, so I just felt in my heart that I somehow have to go there. And it was just, everyone was so loving with each other. It was unbelievable. It's like we are here, understanding and transforming here. And with the pyramid, I didn't go in. The air was not good for me, so I didn't go in, and I walked the labyrinth outside. But I know also for myself, I'm a little claustrophobic, so I would have had challenges there as well. And then looking from the labyrinth, I saw the pyramid there, and I thought, you know, it looked tiny from outside, and there was light, and I tried to stay connected with everyone in there. And I thought, that's how it is. We see that small dark space where we feel ourselves in there, and indeed we are surrounded by light, and it's just our sensation, you know, we feel trapped in there, and while we are surrounded with everyone and it's all open. So it was an amazing, very deeply loving and spiritual retreat, and I felt blessed that I somehow made it there.
Awesome. Thanks, Ursi. Margaret.
Well, what I have to say is not as profound, but last week when the wise women had their
Liturgy.
afterwards, 3 or 4 of us are standing in the aisle here, and a stranger woman that hadn't been here before started talking to us and asking us about the wise women. And we told her how we meet once a month and that we have a leader and a theme, and that we pass the little thing around and we
Talking stick.
How we do it. And she was so surprised. And it turned out that she's a Jewish woman. I don't know how she got there. Probably you brought her. And she said she has her own group of wise women. And she said, oh, but I'm so stuck with it, doing it myself. So she was impressed with the way we were doing our thing. And so what I felt listening to you now was that we sort of progressed with, we added on and passed on our
That's brilliant, Mary.
procedures
That's brilliant.
with this Jewish woman.
Brilliant. So, and I wanted to acknowledge what this woman does here, Margaret, for us. Every Friday morning after Mass, there's a group that meets in Margaret's house. And many of the innovations that we've carried into the bigger group, have been birthed by this group of people, mainly women, who meet every Friday morning after the liturgy in St. Mark's, and come up with these extraordinary ideas that then become part of the leaven for how this community has gone. So my total thanks to you, Margaret, for being the hostess for that over the years, and for all of the people who attend those Friday morning sessions.
It's my pleasure.
Brilliant.
I'd rather they come to my house than I have to go somewhere.
Okay, look. Thanks, Beth.
So I have a couple of thoughts, but the first one is just a question. Was your experience in this sort of sensory deprivation
Yeah.
chamber, was it something like waking, sometimes you wake up in sleep, but
Okay.
you're not exactly awake?
Right, exactly.
And
Yeah.
so you lose your
Right.
sense of yourself.
Right. Sleep.
And you
sleep.
realize nothing, your eyes aren't working, you're feeling nothing's working.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's called sleep paralysis. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's when the mind wakes up but the body isn't awake yet. I think I shared with this you in the past. I remember on 2 different occasions when I was still living in Africa, both times for whatever reason, during siesta time, afternoon naps, which was mandatory in Kenya. At one stage waking up, and couldn't open my eyes whatsoever, couldn't move anything, and totally freaking out. It's like I had no sense of who I was, where I was, when I was, or what I was. It's like this just a void with some kind of a splink of consciousness casting about for an anchor, and it was really freaky. I don't know how long it lasted, and at some stage I managed to move a fingertip or whatever. The second time it happened, about 3 or 4 years later, had the very same experience, but towards the end of it, I made a vow to myself that if it were to ever happen again, I wouldn't struggle against it. I just see what happens, when I don't know who I am, where I am, what I am, when I am, and see how it would resolve itself. And indeed it did. Happened a 3rd time. And at that stage, it was like being in a kind of a contentless consciousness, just pure awareness without any kind of a focus to it or any kind of center or any sense of self. And I have no idea how long it lasted. That was a little bit like, the experience in the sensory deprivation chamber. Again, with the first 2 or 3 minutes maybe of being in total shock. Oh my God, who am I? Where am I? What is this? Am I losing my mind? Am I have I left my body? Have I actually physically died? But having the ability to say, okay, hang in there, see what happens. And then what happened was a whole bunch of really powerful visionary stuff. Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to be conscious but not conscious
Right.
of something,
Right.
because there's nothing
Exactly.
to attach that
Exactly.
consciousness to,
Right. Yeah.
but you're conscious.
Yeah. So I think it's actually the nearest thing we have to an understanding of Source. That Source doesn't have any experiences, which is why Source, created life forms. We are the way in which Source experiences, because Source doesn't have experiences except through us. The whole function of manifest life is to provide experiences for that which is just contentless awareness. So when you get into that space, it's like temporarily you've identified with that awareness, and it's like a cloudless sky. There's nothing to distract. There's just sky.
So I was talking to a woman this week in Salt Lake City, and as we were talking about COJ, she gave me that the response that I get often is, we don't have anything like that here. And so we started to talk about what it meant to build a community and kind of the organic process of building a community. And there's just a huge need for people to connect. So, and people are doing it they're kind of coming in the side door with book groups, with all kinds of things of kind of a shared interest. But the questions and the things they're talking about are going deeper than that. But they don't see it because it's so different from any religion or kind of religious structure they've seen before. They're not attaching it to that. So anyway, I think there's a great need. And so my question for you is, would there be any interest in inviting some of the people who have approached you about building community to have some sort of forum here that we could plan?
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So it's
Because
interesting.
I'd be happy to work on that.
Yeah, awesome. So one of the participants, a man called Larry, he lives in San Mateo. Yeah, San Carlos. A friend of Annika's, a gentleman in his 80s at this stage, who gave himself the nickname Woodsy. And Woodsy, he's completely deaf, he couldn't hear anything, but he contributed probably more than any of the rest of us to the discussions. And he wanted to create a list and create some kind of a forum where those who participated would have some kind of regular dialogue with each other and some kind of like a Zoom session or whatever. So it'd be great to widen that out, to anybody who's interested in just having a forum from any part of the world to discuss spiritual topics on a regular basis, whether it's once a month or whatever. So if you wanted to be the kind of the...
there are people who have no access to
Absolutely,
anything where they are.
absolutely.
And but making that leap but you can build something.
Exactly.
But it will be yours.
Right. Exactly.
It won't be
Exactly.
COJ. It will be
something
that all these personalities create together.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Brilliant, Karen. Brilliant. Janie.
Well, two things. I can certainly see that out of the chaos, I've been noticing that in the world that form seems to happen and the contrast seems to provide the path. Yeah. And I'm watching that over and over. Second thing, and maybe I have three. Second thing is when you were talking about one-on-one, I can see that's the biggest thing to do is take somebody out to dinner that's curious, and out of that change starts to happen. And I think as we get so fixated with having it happen fast that we just can't go anywhere, it's such a slow process of support. And the third thing, I have a question for you. At times in the morning I wake up in awareness. And I don't even notice if my body can move or not move, but my senses are heightened. At one time there was this little piece of eucalyptus in my room was very large and it's at the other end, and I could smell it as if it was right under my nose, and I can hear the birds as if they're sitting on my shoulder. And at one time my housemate's cat walked in and I could smell this kitty as if it was a wild animal. So that was the one that I questioned about, what is this activating in me that is so numb during the day when my mind is going so fast?
That's brilliant, Living. Absolutely brilliant. And so the truth is, we're convinced that this little sensorium of our... Sorry. Mark, you want to be next, was it? Oh, let me just talk to Jane first. We're convinced that, the entire electromagnetic spectrum, if you were to represent it as a line, would go from Los Angeles to New York City. And the visible part of that spectrum is the diameter of a dime. So we're cartographers of reality who are creating our maps from this tiny little slice. Now, I think there are various ways of even extending any one of the senses, whether it's visually, being able to see more color and more vibrancy, whether it's, olfactory, being able to smell stuff like the wildness of a cat. So that's possible to anybody when we learn to go into altered states of consciousness. You can do that in many, many ways. Throughout history, people have experimented with dancing, drumming, music, meditation, plants of various kinds. So there are many ways in which we can begin to access that. But our job is to try to elevate our consciousness in order to expand the sensorium and then add dimensions which are intuitive, for instance, dimensions where the information is not coming through any sense modality, that is coming from a higher level. Maybe it's coming from what I'm going to call the kind of the atmosphere or the pneuma sphere. And we're all privy to that. and we all have connections. It's just that we've forgotten and we've been educated to think we are just these skin-encapsulated egos. Mark.
I read an interesting article this morning, and I wanted to get your definition of religion and your definition of spirituality.
Okay.
Religion is very controversial in its definition.
Right. It is very controversial. And religious historians for over decades have tried to come up with definitions, and there's no one definition that anybody will agree with. Personally, I think that every religion is the result of a mystical impulse that some individual got, shared with the community. Unfortunately, the community tends to become an organization, and the organization to be taken over by an oligarchy, and the oligarchy to insist on orthodoxy, identify heresy, and then institute crusades and inquisitions. That's unfortunately the trajectory. But all religions, at essence, is literally a mystical impulse that some one person or one group, have received. But the tendency then is religion is the organizing of that mystical impulse and trying to create ritual, which can be really good, but can be stifling, to create, a kind of a scripture, which is the ultimate truth that can't be questioned, to create some kind of organizational hierarchy that has to be listened to. And so religion then becomes the subsequent stages of the onion, surrounding itself with more and more protections against the actual mystical impulse. So, for instance, mystics would say that a mystical experience is basically ineffable. It cannot be described. But we all can have them. We all have mystical experiences. But so the first stage, it's not actually that you have a mystical experience, is that you're had by a mystical experience. Because a truly mystical experience, there is no I having it. There's an I being had by it, but there's no I having it. So the first stage is an ineffable experience. The second stage is when you're coming out of it, you're left with some kind of symbolic residue. It may be light, so it's a symbol of the experience. It's not the experience anymore, but it's a symbol of the experience. The third stage is you now try to make sense of the symbol, or to try to make sense of the experience through the symbol, so you start manipulating the symbol and trying to understand it. And the fourth stage is you put together a whole bunch of these understandings of the symbols and you create a theology. By the time you get to theology, you're 3 stages away from the experience. So religion is 2 or 3 stages from the experience. And each of them kind of, it solidifies it, it hardens it, it makes it unable to ride with and respond to changing circumstances. So my definition, that's the best I could do, Mark. Spirituality, on the other hand, then, is, following the impulse of spirit, like a little child in neonate is just filled with curiosity for the environment. So the spiritual person, or the person following the mystical impulse, is going to go where it leads, not a predetermined course. So we can accept that, we can't accept that. Like a little child investigating the environment, it's willing to go anywhere and to interact with everything. Yeah, thanks for that question, Mark. Who was there? Bill.
It seems like there's been increasing interest in the past year or two in the use of psychedelics to catalyze some sort of transformational experience.
Right.
Sounded intriguing enough that I actually managed to try it on 2 occasions, both of which were kind of disappointing. But anyway, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I know, for instance, that shamanism, which is the oldest spiritual system on the planet, that it primarily resorted to what they call plant medicine. But there's a very big difference between something which is taken as a sacrament and something as taken for a high. And so my understanding is, when I study this material, that there are 4 S's involved. The first one is the set, the mindset with which you approach such an encounter. Are you doing there to have fun? Or are you doing there to have a spiritual experience? The second one is setting. What kind of a physical environment are you in? If you're at a dance hall with flashing lights doing MDMA, that's not going to lead to a spiritual experience. The third one is the sitter, and that is having somebody who knows the terrain, and knows the substance, and is willing to stay with you and kind of guide you through the process. And the fourth thing then is the substance. Various substances have very different kinds of effects. But, these plant medicines, particularly, something like ayahuasca in South America, have been used for thousands of years. Now, there's evidence, in fact, that the prophets of Israel, the notion of prophecy first arises in Israel about the year 1100 BCE, after the time of Moses and before the the time of King David, but spanning then from about 1100 BCE down to about the last prophet was about 400 BCE. There's evidence, it went through 3 stages, prophecy. The first stage was called the Guild of the Prophets, where they operated as a group. The second one was called the non-writing prophets, prophets who left a legacy, but not a written legacy. People like Elijah, who never wrote anything. And then thirdly, the great writing prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel. So it went through 3 stages. But there's a lot of evidence that the first one, the group of prophets, were actually ingesting, a mushroom, a kind of mushroom that led to kind of psychedelic experiences. And that many of the great insights that came about as a result of these influences. Now, I think people need to be really, really careful. The 4 S's are really, really important, and there's a difference between experiencing an altered state of consciousness and an altered stage of consciousness. I used this example with you before. This vision I had one time of a multi-story cylindrical skyscraper with 8 rooms on each floor. And each room was represented a different state of consciousness, like meditation or sleep, or wakefulness or being in nature, whatever. But the floors represented the stages of consciousness. So there's a temptation always in the spiritual life, and particularly with plant medicine, to want to visit all the states, but not be interested in moving through the stages. If you don't change who you are because of the experience, if you're not a more loving person, then all of the experiences in the world, all of the states of consciousness in the world, it's like taking a cable car to the top of the mountain so you can see the view, as distinct from, spending 5 days climbing the mountain, camping out there and experiencing everything about it. So the end result is you get the same view, but nothing has changed. You haven't exercised muscles or grown anyway. So I would say that whoever you choose to induce an altered state of consciousness, it has to be in the employ of moving through the stages of consciousness. If you're not moving towards Christ consciousness, no amount of experiences, are going to help. Ingrid.
I'm always curious about the paradox of doing and being, because isn't everything really an inside job? Yeah. What's really going on in our psyche and our heart and our mind and our higher self. And when we really work on our higher self, because we're really in communion with everything all the time, but we don't really receive it or understand it. So how can we just be the transformer of ourselves and just transmit the love, the peace, the goodwill, the forgiveness? Isn't that really the ultimate work as a human, sure, and as a spiritual being?
Absolutely. And there are ways to access that part of the self, because that part of the self is occluded by the space suit and by culture. And so our sense of self is predicated very often that I'm identified with my body, my emotions, my intellect, my job, my relationships, my environment, my ethnicity, my religious affiliation. So identity occludes, a source itself. So there had to be some ways to strip off these things. So it's a real interesting dance. I remember reading a funny story one time about a pastor, who had wanted, the God to speak through him on a Sunday. So he said, I'm going to sit down, I'm not going to make any preparations for my homily, 0. I'm just going to get up there on Sunday morning, and you're going to have to speak through me. So he's standing up there, tongue-tied, and all of a sudden God says to him, you're a very lazy pastor. You're not doing the work to open yourself up to becoming a channel. So there are ways in which we kind of have to prise open the sardine can in which the fish is held, and their spiritual practices. Buddhism says it very powerfully. It says, enlightenment is an accident. But if you meditate regularly, you become accident prone. Yeah? So there are some kinds of practices we have to engage in. So there is some element of doing that releases the being. Being on its own is God without experiences. God chose, to create beings who could experience and who had to kind of remember who they were by particular kinds of spiritual practice. So it's a real dance between being and doing. It's not just one or the other. Yeah. Teresa?
This week I've just had the opportunity to hear some beautiful things, and I think I might speak to Ingrid's question a little bit. With my book group, we've been reading Desmond and Mafo Tutu's book, Made for Goodness. And he writes in just the simplest manner. It's extraordinary. But he speaks of being attuned to our inherent goodness as a gift, as our gift from the divine. And then he speaks of living out of our goodness. And the thing is, if we choose to live out of our goodness, we have automatically connected with spirit. And it sounds very simple, but of course, as we all know in practice, there's a challenge there. And then at the Kabbalah group this week, we had a visitor who was from southern France, an American woman who has lived there for 22 years. And she spoke about looking at beauty. And one of the things that struck me is that our culture forgets about beauty. You know, they think it belongs only to artists or whatever. And she spoke of creating beauty as how we live our lives. And of course, having participated in Kabbalah, the point that's at the heart chakra, Tiferet, is translated as truth, beauty, and goodness. And, you know, I think in our culture, we've been focused on truth a lot, especially in these days politically. But I think the element of goodness and beauty, those two elements, are just so enriching. And perhaps this is what, when we look at what's happening in the world, maybe this is how we can grow in ourselves and offer something to others.
Beautiful, Teresa. Beautiful, Livy. It's gorgeous. Yeah. We need to shine light on it, not throw gasoline on it. All right, guys. Thanks for your patience. It's 11 o'clock, so before we continue with the Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.